Now, this whole inflation issue, people often see it as nothing more than the stress of not being able to make it to the end of the month. In reality, it is one of the oldest and most powerful tools of destruction in history. Think about it, empires with massive walls and disciplined armies still ended up helpless against it. Because inflation is not something that destroys a society outright, it destroys a society's belief in itself. When money loses its value, trust erodes along with it, trust in one another, trust in the state, and even trust in tomorrow. That's why, from the fall of Rome to today's supermarket lines, we keep seeing the same story told in different versions. Let's start at the beginning, with Rome. Back then there was no paper money, only coins. The empire's expenses kept growing, more soldiers to guard the borders, bigger arenas to distract the public, grander temples to project power. But there wasn't enough silver in the treasury. So they chose what seemed like a clever solution: let's just reduce the silver content of the coins a little, who will notice? At first, nobody did, but once this process began, it became impossible to stop. Over time, the denarius, once a solid silver coin, became almost pure copper. Soldiers still received the same number of coins, but their purchasing power fell. Farmers realized that the money they earned from selling their crops could no longer buy the same goods a week later. Merchants started changing prices daily. People stopped looking at the emperor's face on the coin and started weighing it instead. What looked like a minor monetary adjustment was actually the breaking of the most fundamental contract between the state and its citizens. Rome was shaken not only by invading tribes, but by this internal erosion of trust. The next major lesson comes from Spain. After the discovery of the Americas, gold and silver flowed into Europe like a flood. Spanish treasuries overflowed. Everyone believed they were infinitely rich. But here's the paradox: enormous wealth that arrives without labor or production often turns into a curse. So much precious metal entered the economy that its value itself declined. Gold became more abundant, and the prices of everything else soared. The Spanish mindset shifted: why bother weaving cloth or producing wine when we have gold and can buy everything from abroad? Domestic industry collapsed. Artisans lost their livelihoods. One day the gold ran out, but the habits remained. What was left behind was a country that produced little, imported everything, and suffered from permanently high prices. The vaults had once been full, but the economy had hollowed out. It was wealth like a bribe, pleasing in the short term, devastating in the long run. The real horror, however, arrived in the modern era with paper money. Weimar Germany stands as a textbook example. Defeated in World War I, Germany was burdened with massive reparations. The economy was in ruins. The government chose to pay debts and wages by continuously printing money. At first, it seemed manageable. Then it spiraled out of control. By 1923, the situation was nightmarish. A loaf of bread cost billions, even trillions of marks. People carried their wages in boxes because the stacks of banknotes were too large to hold. The most painful part was the destruction of savings. Someone who had worked their entire life hoping to buy a house woke up one morning unable to afford even a newspaper. Debtors, meanwhile, celebrated as their debts evaporated. This created enormous resentment and a sense of injustice. People felt the entire system had collapsed. That dark environment became fertile ground for extreme ideologies. Inflation didn't just raise prices, it altered the destiny of a nation. For some countries, inflation is not an occasional earthquake but a constant landslide. Argentina is one of the clearest examples. In the early 20th century, immigrants described it as a golden country. But political instability and populist economic policies pushed it into a vicious cycle: run budget deficits, print money to cover them, inflation rises, impose price controls, production falls, deficits grow even larger. During the hyperinflation of 1989, people's behavior fundamentally changed. The moment they received their paycheck, they dragged family members to the supermarket and rushed to spend it, because hours later, the same money wouldn't buy the same basket of goods. In 2001, bank withdrawals were frozen, and the famous Cacerolazo pot-banging protests erupted. From the early 2010s onward, inflation again climbed above 25%, then 40%. This time, people's reflex was automatic: dollars. Converting wages into foreign currency became a survival instinct. Inflation there distorted people's sense of time. Long-term planning disappeared. Everything became about today and right now. And then there is the most brutal example of the 21st century, Venezuela. Here, inflation went beyond an economic policy failure and turned into a humanitarian crisis. A system built entirely on oil revenues subsidized almost everything and kept prices artificially low. Fuel was nearly free, supermarket shelves looked cheap, on paper. But there was no production. When oil prices fell, the state's finances collapsed. The only response was more money printing. Eventually, money itself lost meaning. People received salaries in bundles of banknotes, yet those bundles could buy only a few kilograms of lentils. Pharmacies ran out of medicine. Hospitals lost electricity. Millions fled the country simply to survive. This was inflation in its final stage, the complete loss of money's function and the breakdown of social life. Iran's case follows a different dynamic. Decades of international sanctions isolated the country from the global economy. Foreign currency inflows were limited, yet the state maintained heavy spending through subsidies and public projects. When revenues fell short, money printing filled the gap. The result has been years of chronic inflation around 40%. The striking part is the gap between official inflation figures and real prices on the street. People no longer trust state statistics. In some shops, you can see 2 price tags. This erodes trust not only in money, but in institutions themselves. Instead of asking, what will happen next year, people ask, how will I get through this week? Inflation becomes a psychological weapon as much as an economic one. Another extreme case is Zimbabwe. In the early 2000s, controversial land reforms collapsed agricultural production.